Well, good afternoon, folks, and welcome to the virtual session. We have John Gray with us here to talk to us about a topic that I think is new to us. So, with that, I'll turn it over to John.
Well, thank you. It's good to be here, and I appreciate folks coming on to the presentation. We're going to talk. What we're going to talk today about is something that I've been around most of my life in one form or another, but it's the marine rail barges that operate up in the Pacific Northwest. And I should paraphrase operate. It's more operated in the past than are operating today. There are still a few of the systems in there, and we'll get to that. But it's kind of a different form of railroading that is a little bit different from the types of rail marine operations that, for the most part, you saw in the States. In that the equipment has to be heavier duty simply because you are getting, in many cases, out in the open sea. The length of some of the movements are significantly longer than most of the harbor and river movements that you see in the States. The most comparable thing to it in the States would be the operations that used to take place between, and actually one of which is still operating, between the East Coast and the Gulf Coast and the Caribbean area. Again, that was on the same scale as we're talking about in the Northwest. It was done for a lot of the same reasons: isolation at various points, and it's had for the most part the same fate, in that as technology changes, the number of the operations have decreased to where there's only a few, 2 or 3 left in the Pacific Northwest, and only one major one in the Caribbean, out of Mobile to operating from Mobile down into southern Mexico. So that's what we're gonna talk about today. Area in question is about 1,500 miles long. It literally has probably tens of thousands of islands along the way. There are coastal mountains that run almost the entire distance. Very few places where you even have a beach area along the shore. Lots of rain, lots of wind, some really nasty weather in the winter, and particularly in the Gulf of Alaska. And in 1976, when I started collecting data on the operations there, there were at least 36 rail car barge terminals in the Pacific Northwest, active ones. I know of probably a dozen to maybe 20 more that were inactive at the time, and in some cases the rail slips were still there, but they weren't operating then. But these were the active ones that during some work I did with Canadian National, we were trying to track down all the ones that were actually operating and where you could get a barge in and out of the terminal. So the topics: why the barges, where were they, and what kind of equipment and facilities do you need to operate, and how to operate. And occasionally there will be things on the modeling side thrown in as issues that I've learned from operating my own barge system down in my basement. So we'll get started on it. Uh, the barges in the Northwest go back a fair distance. 1880s and 1890s, you were seeing stuff starting to appear along the Columbia River. There was, again, for a lot of the same reasons, it actually became active on the coast, more active on the coast, because you're trying to reach a railroad's trying to reach someplace that's isolated. Um, it was helped by the fact that there's along the British Columbia and Alaska coast, and actually much of the Washington coastal region at that time, there was very little access to the coast itself uh, overland. You didn't tend to have much in the way of highways, very little in railroads. That would change over time, particularly in Washington. But as the map from 1976 indicates, in BC and Alaska, a lot of that remained the same and actually does today. There are lots of developable resources in the area, but very relatively small local markets that were available then. Not somewhat larger markets today, but still more resources than can be used in just the West Coast area. Access, and there was a need for access to the continental rail networks. There were long distances between some of those resources and the economic centers, usually in the Midwest and the eastern U.S. and Canada that could actually use them. And the resource developers needed flexible market access. They were not probably going to sell to the same buyer for the entire time that they operated. In some cases, that would be the case. They would actually sell that way. But it was the exception rather than the rule, considering that many of these resources were forest product based. So, barge operations, what did they do? Uh, the purpose of them is, first of all, was to connect railroads that were not otherwise a part of the continental system. And that's where you got the largest locations, and that's where they have just survived the longest. Case in point, Alaska Railroad and Vancouver Island railroads. The barge operations are still intact there. They've declined dramatically on Vancouver Island, but the frequency and the volumes in Alaska, even though it has changed in structure over the years, is pretty stable. There were isolated branch lines in the Northwest that weren't connected to the major networks. Milwaukee Road was a classic of that. It had a connection that was to see Canadian Pacific through a barge service, not through a land connection. Likewise, Union Pacific connected with what became British Columbia Rail by barge service up until about 15 or 20 years ago. And you had Milwaukee Road also connecting to isolated branch lines on their own railroad through the barge services. They connected what we called up there along the coast waterlocked industrial plants. And that's a plant that does not have any access by land into the plant. There no way to drive there, no way to get railroad in there. Usually in pretty rough territory where these occurred. But these waterlocked industries, the last two of those that were being served by barges lost their service in late last year, and so when the mills closed down. We found at least 13 locations um, in uh, the late 70s and going into the 80s where you had service to these isolated plants, the majority of which were some type of pulp or paper mill. But 13 locations in the region. Um, and then in the case of of railroads that didn't have much money to work with, in this case, Milwaukee's roads connections with uh, Canadian Pacific Great Eastern, and what Pacific Great Eastern, now British Columbia Railway, now CN actually, uh, uh, it gave them it gave them opportunity for interchange, and in the case of Pacific Great Eastern, gave them an outlet to Vancouver because they didn't have the money to build the last 30 miles of their railroad into Vancouver until the 50s. Uh, this is part of the same thing. And when I'm talking about railroads lacking resources to complete land connections, and it also turned out to be something that provided supplier competition for particularly for the waterlock mills, but for all the mills that had access to rail. It gave them access to many more suppliers because you find that a lot of the suppliers to the mills had car barge slips at their factory where they were producing whatever the mill was consuming. Uh, and then, of course, the flexible resource market access that we talked about earlier. So, 1976, still a pretty busy time along the coast. The summary here, and I assume that this will be made available. That the presentation will be made available. So I'm not going to go through details like this, but the summary of where all of the barge slips that were active in the mid 70s and really up into the early 80s is pretty much on this map. As you can see, it's the real center of everything was in the area between Seattle and the lower mainland coast of British Columbia and on Vancouver Island. And that was kind of the center of rail barge activity on the West Coast, had been for a long time. Is not today, interestingly enough. While it still exists there, it's on a much smaller scale. And as I said earlier, it's kind of eclipsed by the service to Alaska at this point in time. Back in '76, these were the routes that involved Alaska that were common carrier. In other words, railroad to railroad routes. There were at least 3 origin points for the Alaska trade at that time on the West Coast for rail barges. Prince Rupert with Canadian National. For CNCP in Burlington Northern at that time on the Fraser River Delta south of Vancouver, and then the terminals in Seattle that were in that crowd. The common carrier operations in the lower part of it. Again, there was still a substantial amount of that. You had the operations from British Columbia Railroad to itself in I'm sorry, to UP in this case in Seattle, and that is an operation that I actually managed for UP in the late 90s and early 20s. And then the biggest one in that area was the Vancouver to Nanaimo operations of Canadian Pacific. At that point, they still had some relatively new equipment that was coming that was in the service. Um, Canadian National still operated the remnants of a service to Vancouver Island, and then the Milwaukee Road still had the remnants of its service over to the Olympic Peninsula at Port Townsend. That one was taken over after Milwaukee left us in 1980, but didn't last too much longer after 1980. Let's see. In terms of the contract services along the coast, it's kind of easy to describe the ones between Seattle and Alaska because they're fairly straightforward. You had operations out of Seattle to mills in Ketchikan and Sitka that the mills being large enough to have their own yards to operate to handle the carload business. And you had good sized barges making the trip every about once or twice a week, depending upon how busy the mills were. Car barges that would handle about 35 to 40 rail cars on those routes. You had separate operations to each of the mills out of Seattle. Out of Prince Rupert, Canadian National operated a rather interesting operation to a terminal in a place called Saxman, and it was a little out of the way spot that had been picked for some reason that I have never identified as a location where they were going to have a liquefied petroleum gas terminal for distribution throughout Southeast Alaska. The only reason I can believe it was at Saxman is because it was a safe place to store LPG away from any population center. But they had a operation taking tank cars there at least once a week, sometimes more than that, out of Prince Rupert. Particularly in the winter, you could have more than once a week service. And then, as far as the contract service down in the lower part of the Northwest, it was everywhere to everywhere. And it was more than just from active rail terminals to operating mills or mines or what have you. It also included movements between suppliers to those mills and mines that had barge terminals in their production facility. And this was particularly true for the ones that were producing chemicals for paper making. Almost any place that the basics chemicals for producing paper were located in this area almost universally had one or more rail barge terminals serving that production facility. And they would have their own contracts with barge operators going to the various mills. They would not actually use railroad operations for any part of the movement of the rail cars to the mills. Well, it's a little bit different today because you can sum up what was in all four of the prior maps on one map today. The principal and the biggest operation by far in this is the operation between Seattle and Whittier, Alaska. It runs at least weekly, sometimes more than once a week during the busier seasons. Carries both rail cars and containers on the barge at this point. And is the largest barges that have operated in that type of service up to this time. The only other common carrier operation is a much smaller operation between the Fraser River on Anasis Island and terminal there, and the Nanaimo terminal, what used to be the Canadian Pacific terminal on Vancouver Island. That operates more frequently, but with far fewer rail cars on it, either per week or per year than are moved in the Alaska operations. At this point, or at least a couple months ago when I last checked, there were still two contract operations to pulp and paper mills on Vancouver Island that are also going out of Anasis Island, all using the same barge that were used for that's used for the connection to the Southern Railway operations on Vancouver Island. And the reason I say the last time I checked it is because both of them were in discussions about whether they were going to keep their mills open, and that has been a frequent problem. Is just closing of the pulp and paper mills along the coast for at least for the rail car barge operations. So that's kind of the geography of where all this has taken place. But what's needed for this kind of operation? First of all, you have to have a barge slip. You've got to have something attached to a dock or a restraint system that you can use for loading and unloading the barge. You've got to have a yard to switch the barge, not necessarily a large yard, but one that can hold as many cars as you're going to both take off of and put on the barge that serves your location. Obviously, a locomotive to actually switch the barge, and a barge with rails on the main deck, but also you can't just convert any barge to one to operate with rail cars, because they usually need to be reinforced below deck, right under the rail, or because you've got a lot of weight concentrated in one place, as opposed to how most barges are built, which is to carry that same weight spread out over the vessel's deck. And then a tug of sufficient capacity that you can actually move the barge and its cargo. And what sufficient capacity is really varies with where you're going. If it was part of the operation down on the lower mainland of British Columbia and Puget Sound, you could have fairly small tugs that could operate in that service, because you were handling relatively small barges, and because you were on what were essentially inland waterways, even though they were ocean, it was the ocean. You were hidden behind islands a lot for the movements. You could get by with less powerful tugs to do that. If you were going out in the Gulf of Alaska, and you were towing two rail barges behind the tug, which was very common in the 70s and 80s, you needed about a 10 to 12,000 horsepower tug to take that. And most of the tugs, incidentally, in the service along that coast, use at that time at least, most of them were powered with EMD diesels. And so, most of the tugs and the fishing boats in that area. As a side thing to mention, the Alaska Railroad actually did a business in the winter of repairing marine diesels for tugs and fishing boats that operated along the coast. Kept the Basically kept the mechanical force working all winter. Uh, Important to note is that obviously the barge track and the barge slip tracks have to match. It's best if you can actually get the cars on and off a barge, um, even if you have only one track, and you don't have a match. But if you're going to have multiple track slip, needs to match the spacing between the tracks on the barges. Now, there's no formal standards around what the spacing will be, but at least on that coast, most of the equipment put in service over the last 60 years has 11-foot spacing between the center line of the track for the spacing on the barge and on the barge slips. And as noted on the bottom, those distances in those four scales. Okay, it was almost universal in the Northwest that the barge slips had three tracks connecting with the barge. There are some exceptions. CP was the biggest one with its single track operation on a number of the slips. And as it is today, it's still a single track on the slips that are operated that connect the CP slips. The Crowley slips in Seattle, one for UP, one for BN, both had two tracks. That meant on the 8-track barges that you had to move the barge three times after it was initially positioned in order to unload the barge and then to reload it with loaded cars. You had to do the same thing. So again, for modeling purposes, anything between 1 and 3 tracks will do. It'll work well. Reasonably represent actually what was in service. Personally, I had a 2-track slip. It had an unfortunate accident in a move a short time back. So this is one of the remaining barges working the coast. This is the one that works the CP movements, or not it's not actually from CP slips anymore or for CP, but the Southern Railway of British Columbia, the short line that took over their operations on Vancouver Island, and that has an extensive switching service in Vancouver, now operates the barges also, are a sister company within their organization, C-SPAN. But this is about all it takes to take care of Vancouver Island on a regular basis, because this same barge also works two mills right now. And up until late 2023, worked 2 other mills. So it's relative, by the time you've done it, worked it 6-7 days a week between Vancouver and the mills, it will have carried a fair number of cars, including those going to Vancouver Island. But it's nowhere near what CP was handling, say, back in the 70s and 80s on the island, or what they were handling to the various mills that were both on the lower mainland and the island. So uh, the picture that we just saw here, repeated here, it's on the way to en route to Annacis Island, so it's coming back for, probably with loaded boxcars and empty tank cars. And if that's the case, it looks like it's probably been to one of the mills and not to the not necessarily to the Southern Railway on Vancouver Island itself. Um, Interestingly, this is it. When I looked up the barge itself, it was one that the C-SPAN had used for us operating between North Vancouver and Seattle for Union Pacific interchange with BC Rail. And at the time that they were using this barge for us, it loaded over the rear, as most barges do. It's now been converted where you can do front end loading. But also, it had all 5 tracks access. You could access them directly from the slip. So it has been dramatically rebuilt to handle the what you would be doing to with the at Vancouver Island and the mills. Um, and the lower picture is the single track span at Nanaimo on Vancouver Island, and as it was used as is being used today by Southern Railway. These are all of the places that this barge handles. The top picture is the slip that it uses on Fraser River. Um, Again, it's a relatively short slip, the slip itself, since it's on the river and you don't have a huge tidal variation in there. It's low enough in the river where you don't have too much river variation, or do you get hit with much tidal variation on it. The other photos are where it's used, and I apologize for the quality on some of them, but I had to take screenshots off of maps to get be able to find anything that looked down on the slips themselves. But all of them have been converted to one-track slips, even though all the others, other than the one at Nanaimo, were once 3-track slips. I found the records on all 3 of those in some documents that Canadian National published back in the early 80s, which lists all these slips as being 3-track. And the evidence on the ground shows even today on them. Another strange slip was the one that Alaska Railroad had at a place called Valdez that was served by a barge service several times a week, coming out of the main barge terminal at Whittier. Mostly during the construction of the Trans-Alaska Pipeline for oil that was between the construction period between about 1971 and realistically when everything was finished on it about early 1978. So this operated for about 5 or 6 years on there. It was very primitive. You put the barge into the dock base into the dock when the tide was in, and you waited for the tide to go out. The barge settled down onto the gravel, and you switched the barge. It was something very simple. The slip itself was 2 rails that were welded into place that you would you would take out when the barge left, and somebody would come back and weld them in when the barge got there the next time. So very primitive. It wasn't something that uh, was built for long-term use, but it worked very well and handled thousands of cars during its lifetime. Now, the slip at Saxman, Alaska, where they handled the LPG tank cars, was very similar to this, which was kind of scary, actually, that you would be operating LPG cars over something like that, but they pulled it off. Um, this is the slip in Whittier, Alaska, that and this is the one of the older slips that was used by Crowley Maritime. There have been four different slips on that end of the Alaska operations. This one was fairly long, but you had about an 18-foot tide in the harbor there, times during the year, and so you literally ran the rail service to this slip by the tide tables, not a timetable, but by the tide tables, because you dispatched a train from Anchorage so that it would arrive in Whittier about 2 hours into a rising tide or 2 hours into a dropping tide. And then they had 3 hours to switch the barge and get it unloaded, probably go to lunch, and then come back a couple hours later, 3 or 4 hours later, and switch or put the back load on the barge. Take the cars off the first in one tidal segment, put them back on in the other. Um, if it were one of the high tides where you had to deal with an even shorter period, the crew could end up having to stay over for the night and or the day, as it were, and get some rest before they could finish doing the barge. Problem was that it was because the water got as deep as quickly as it did in the fjord there. It was just about impossible to build a slip that was long enough to handle the entire, or and still is, the entire tidal range that you had in that harbor. Uh, Going back down to British Columbia, these two were the last two vessels that were built for Canadian Pacific for its services around that area. Both of them could be loaded on either loaded on either end or unloaded on either end, and both of them could work the one-track slips in downtown Vancouver and over at Nanaimo on the island. The Both of them were also equipped so that you could use a three-track slip, which made them much more flexible than their predecessors. The first one is the one on the lower right, the Trailer Princess. She was put into service in 1966 and was taken out of service about 5 to 6 years ago by C-SPAN, who inherited her. And after they replaced it with the barge that you saw. The other one, Carrier Princess, is can also carry, in addition to the freight cars, can also carry passengers for across the straits. They carrier was in service until about a year ago when they finally took her out of service. She had been hauling almost entirely trailers and automobiles rather than freight cars during most of her life. The uh, the barges basically replaced her. Uh, they are a trailer. They are basically both of them are basically self-powered barges, and so they they were in handling characteristics and how you work them at the slips. There was very little difference between working one of these two and the barges that were in the CP service. Uh, the it's and I noticed that we lost in one form or another. We lost uh, the uh, the the lettering that goes up in the upper right on this. I'm not sure how we did that, but what it basically says is the equipment on the land side and the water side have to match on these things. Um, and that sometimes problems that can arise that it takes a little imagination to resolve. The case in point here is the Canadian National barge that operated between Prince Rupert, BC, and Whittier. Uh, when the Canadian National had the thing built for them, they also decided to change they had to change the way that the slip was positioned in Prince Rupert in order to accommodate an 8-track barge. They had been accommodating 4-track, 5-track, and an occasional 6-track barge in the slips in Prince Rupert. Uh, Problem was they didn't do the measurements quite right, and they missed it by about a foot on on the distance that you needed between the dock and the tracks on the slip on the barge. Net result was that you couldn't unload but 6 tracks on the barge. You couldn't actually make them match, and they had to basically take the track that had the 2 outside tracks and uh, connect those to track 6 in order to unload the 2 outside tracks. Now, this solved the problem, but it probably created a long-term problem of its own, and that is that when you do that, it changes the way the forces are distributed on the deck of the barge, and probably the off-pattern weight was probably one of the contributing factors to the barge basically having a relatively short lifetime as these barges go. She only made it about 36 years. And simply because there was repair work that needed to be done on the barge that was too costly to justify with the traffic that was available at the time. CN took it out of service in 2021, and it can't go back into service without major repairs. Most of them I've heard centered around the stern, which would you'd expect with what the solution was here. Of course, the other impact of having to do this is you lost 2 to 4 cars per voyage just due to the shortened track space. Um, the in Seattle Harbor in the 80s, you had actually 4 slips working that harbor. There was the one that was for Northern Pacific, Burlington Northern, in West Seattle that loaded one barge a week for Alaska, for cars coming off of BN. Union Pacific loaded one on Harbor Island area in Seattle. Um, and that one is the only one of the four that's still in service. Right next to that was one run by Napton Tug and Barge, served by Union Pacific, out of service today, but which basically supported both the traffic going to the Alaska pulp mills and to traffic coming to UP uh, from uh, southern British Columbia. And then there was a Milwaukee road slip, which was, as expected, the most primitive of them, which went out of service about 1983 or 1984 when they finally gave the short line that had taken over the operations there finally gave up on it. This was one of the earlier barges for Alaska. It's shown in Whittier, waiting its turn at either waiting its turn at the dock, or since the cars are empty, probably waiting for the other barge to be unloaded at the dock. And Tug will pick the two of them up and take them back to Seattle. But it's one of the earlier ones. It's 6 tracks. Could hold about 35, usually about 35 cars on it, replaced by 8-track barges that were for the most part, about 40 to 50 feet longer, that could usually get around 50 cars onto the barge, unless you were moving something like the auto racks you see on there, on that one, which cut the volume in terms of number of carloads that you could have dramatically. Now here it's kind of hard in this picture to see them, but it's the 400 two of the 400 foot barges, the 8-track barges. Barge 414 is the one that will be used for the UP traffic coming out of Seattle going to Alaska. And the one beside it over there, which is 500-4, will be the one that is used for the BN traffic. The reason that it's used for the BN traffic is that there was, at the time, Crowley was also bringing up about 100 trailers per trip on the second deck of that barge. There was not room on Harbor Island to get the trailers prepped and to have a serving yard for the barge that included the trailer space. That could be done in West Seattle. And so that one always carried the Burlington movements. Now, I will say that if either one of the barges were not running full and the other one had extra cargo, you would get UP traffic on the Burlington barge and Burlington traffic on the UP barge if it became necessary. So it was not something that was absolute by any means. So I give you a quick look at what it's like to load these things and get them ready to go. This is one of them being backloaded in Alaska. I'm sorry, he's being unloaded in Alaska on this one, and they have not taken the containers off the top deck or the stuff that they stack on the containers off the top deck either. This is the current barge that's operating in that service. Again, an 8-track with the second deck for containers and heavy equipment. But as you can see, you can get they do not they don't stay in one place. The barges go up and down as you're unloading them. Uh, it has the last loads in this case on the right side. As soon as they take those off, they'll start putting the empties back on that side. Now, fortunately, the slips, as they're designed for these large barges like this, are such that they can rotate just a little, and it makes it a lot easier when you have a slip like that that can rotate to the level of the barge deck. On the other hand, we have those same barges in Seattle. Again, they load the containers now at a separate terminal several miles away from where the UP loads the barges in Seattle today. They load it basically by moving. You have to move the barge around while you're loading it. They load the first three tracks on one side. They load the second three tracks on the other side, and then the last ones loaded are the two tracks in the middle. That's to keep it as stable as possible. As you'll note on the on the on the on uh, the lower one, they do get off center. And once again, you've got to have a little bit of ability of the slip to accommodate that. But they've loaded one side on and then moved the barge over to load the other side. The interesting load this day. The car going on there is on the barge onto track 8 here is it is an ex-Empire Builder dome car that Alaska Railroad acquired in 1980. It had been in the States for rebuilding and and it was on its way home and is here being shoved down and onto the barge to go home. It was the only dome car that the Spokane, Portland, Seattle Railroad had at the time. And as I say, it is still in service in Alaska. Now, in the lower photo on the right, it's clear that things have kind of flattened out on the bottom. You've got relatively equal weight, maybe a little extra on the right side now, and then they'll next move the two center tracks against the slip and finish the loading. And on the Alaska end, you have a yard in Whittier that does only two things. And I focus on this route simply because it's by far the busiest route of the rail car barges in the Northwest anymore. But basically, you've got you've got two small yards in town. One, the carload yard, where you sort and prepare the cars for freight cars for loading. Then the intermodal yard, where all the containers go to head out for destination. And since the railroad is the sole purpose of the barge, all of the containers leave the yard unless there's a real emergency on something. All the containers leave here by rail. They are not trucked out from the area. this, and then a view of the Seattle side again is basically, that's the same type of barge in Seattle. Since this photo was taken, they have actually extended the upper deck so that you can accommodate more containers on the upper deck of the barge. The Canadian National barge, the one that had the deck problems, was the largest barge in the service there. It was about 425 to 430 feet long. It was easily the largest rail barge in the Northwest, even bigger than the Crowley barges of the current Alaska Marine Line barge. Ceased operation in 2021, and this is, I'm afraid the photo here is of her last trip south from Alaska with all the Canadian National empties loaded on the barge. Okay, so we get to my barge, and I ask that you not laugh. The thing is 40 years old, uh, but it works, and it provides a lot of fun for the first view up there on the top from the bow has the towing chain on it. It has the ocean bay, a bow for taking it out into the ocean to tow. Although one this small would be unlikely to be out there. Problem was when I built it, I didn't have room for anything larger than that, and even in N scale, one of the 6 or 8 track barges takes a hefty piece of real estate, so it just wasn't the space to put it. This one, as I'll show you. Oh, one of the key items on this one is I have couplers on the barge to couple the cars to it on the bow of the barge. One of the and that is actually prototypical on the ocean-going barges. The ones that are out in the ocean, they tend to have this feature on it. And talking to the people working the tugs from the barges, they're pretty adamant that from their perspective, that's what keeps the rail cars from getting away when they get into high seas. All the other stuff that they do with it is interesting and helps, but this is what keeps things working when they get into high seas. You can see it on the barge here. We're looking down where I've got the cars coupled into the bow. It's actually a much more useful feature on a model even than it is on the prototype, for the same simple reason that when you move the barge away from the slip to replace it with another barge, the cars don't always want to cooperate, and and so it's basically kept quite a few of my freight cars from taking a long and very hazardous trip to the floor. So it is really useful to have that feature on a model barge. Here we've got the barge. It's loaded with cars. You can see that in the loading how much of a difference length makes. And particularly between the first track on the top photo, the first track at the very top, which in that case has 5 box cars on the first track, but the next one where you have 5 gondolas or 4 gondolas, they're only 2 to 3 feet longer in scale feet than the box cars, but once you put them on the barge, you have to find something really short, in this case, a very small tank car, to be able to put a fifth car on there. And as you see on the box cars, the the one car overhangs the end. And you can see just how much it overhangs the end in the bottom photo. That's not acceptable. And so you have to get a different car to put on the end that's actually only 40 feet. If you have actual 40-foot cars, you can get 5 cars per track. Anything else, it's actually fewer cars per track that you can line up on there. And as it showed with the on the outside track there, the third track down, with the tank cars, which are 50 feet, you're clearly only going to get 4 cars on a track on this. Uh, Fortunately, that just gives me more chance to switch the barge. Uh, Now, one very brief look at the first startup years of the service from Seattle to Alaska. The first 2 startup years, they weren't without incident. The first barge was the Canadian National Barge coming out of Prince Rupert. It first docked in Alaska in May of 1962. Had 4 tracks. Basically, with cars of the time, you could um, carry about, on a good trip, maybe 15, 16 cars on the barge. Um, as an aside, I'd note that 40-foot cars were always a precious item if you could find them to put on the barge. And the service to Alaska that CN had became the last refuge for most of their 40-foot box cars, for the simple reason that you could get them on the barge, and there was something, a very high value commodity that they could handle in those cars. CN could get both their 2,500, 3,000 mile haul from Montreal to Prince Rupert, and then get the barge haul beyond that, because CN collected the revenue from the barge. What were they hauling? Snowmobiles. And there was always room for one of those cars on the barge. One way or the other, you'd always find place for those cars. The first interchange car, though, was actually a Lehigh Valley car. It was the first interchange car the Alaska Railroad had ever had, and came off the CN barge here. About a year later, Crowley Maritime out of San Francisco started operation of the service from Seattle to Whittier. Again, a smaller barge than they would have eventually. They first upgraded from these 300-foot barges to 376-foot 6-track barge, and then up to the 405-foot 8-track barges. But it's the slip that was built in Alaska was one of the 3-track slips, and it was one that you could handle a barge like this with only one movement of the barge after it was initially positioned. So this all happened August 10th, 1963. Just a few months later, 7.5 months after the Crowley service begins, there's an earthquake, huge earthquake, and that occurs where the epicenter is about 60 miles from Whittier. Earthquake lasts only 5 minutes. Most of the railroad facilities made it through the earthquake, including the barge slip, but not the tsunami that followed close behind it. As you'd imagine, when you're only 60 miles from the epicenter, the tsunami is pretty violent in this, and so that took out the barge slip completely. What was the alternative? Well, the Army had found a floating crane of theirs in a Navy yard in northern Washington. A couple days after the earthquake, they had it en route to Alaska, and uh, the loaded cars were handled off the barge by the cranes. They were all craned off the barge for about the next 75, 80 days. Now, during that time, the railroad did not send any empties back. It was, quite frankly, it was too hard to get the cars to actually be on the rails on the barge itself. That the barge kept moving little bits at a time, and it was hard. Really, they tried a couple. They tried a couple empties and decided they'd just keep them until they had a slip back in service. The crane worked really well, except for this one problem here, and it's the train ship Alaska. Her maiden voyage had been scheduled to arrive first week of April in 1964. There wasn't a slip for her there by the time she was ready to leave Seattle. Thing about this was that it was fast. It could carry as many freight cars as the other two services combined. And because it was the fastest ship on the North Coast at the time, it provided an opportunity for the railroad to get into the perishables market between Seattle and Alaska. And so there was a lot of pressure to get a slip back in operation. So 78 days after the earthquake, she did dock, and it was on a brand new slip. On June 13th, she arrived, unloads 48 freight cars on the maiden voyage. New three-track steel barge slip this time. Structure had lasted for another 47 years. It hadn't gotten knocked out since then. And with that, questions?
I've got one if you don't mind. Um, on the gantries that you were just like, for example, you just showed, the counterweights, how do they lift the float dock up? Is that from underneath? On,
No,
on the East Coast, like I'm on the Long Island Railroad, and the float docks over there, they had a gantry with a crane that lifted them from above.
well, the on the float on the slips up there, and actually, what the type of gantry you're talking about that lifts from below is the type that's been installed on the latest um, where on the latest dock in Whittier. It has the same type of mechanism you're talking about that they did on some of the East Coast docks. They found out that if you did it right, you could accommodate a longer interval for the tides. But on the ones with the towers on it, there are counterweights inside the towers.
Right.
They drop down inside the towers, and basically the lifting mechanism is basically to when you are, the counterweights themselves will lower the, you break the counterweights, put a braking system on the counterweights. That slows down so you can do the lowering of the slip onto the deck. On the lifting of it, the room up at the top has motors in it that actually pulls the counterweights up so that they are rather the counterweights go down, the dock goes up on that. And so when they need to be lifted, it's with the motors. When they're going down, they use the brake system on them.
But it attaches to the dock on what, on the sides?
No, it's all on the it's all on the in the two towers that are going that you have, and then the building across the top of the towers there.
I mean, but the last picture you showed, I didn't see a building across the top. That's why.
Yeah, that was the old one. They learned that was when it was originally built. Within a couple years, they realized that they needed something that could lift more weight, and they put a building across the top, took the smaller engines out of the structures that they had and put larger ones in the building to lift the counterweights.
Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, and also, when the barges docked, did they have locking pins that lock the barge? I know, like on the East, I'm familiar. I model a Long Island, and I've got a car float on my layout, and I use the Walthers kit,
Mhm.
which is very similar to what the Long Island used, and they had locking pins that when the barge pulled up to the float dock, they would lock it in place with these big, heavy steel pins that I think they used to like a sledgehammer to move them, to slide them. So they locked the barge to the bridge. Did they
Yeah.
do the same thing on?
Yeah. Yeah, on all the ones I've seen in the Northwest, you have the same type of locking arrangement on them. There are various types of it, but it does the same thing. Basically, the barge is attached to the slip.
Mhm.
Uh, at the same time, up there, in fact, in all the operations, both all the way from Seattle up the coast, um, they also usually have some way to restrain the barge itself, because of the currents that you get and the tidal variation that you get in the West. And so they've got various types of piling structures that you can tie the barge off against, usually on both sides of the barge, so that you tie both sides each time you put it there, and then you have a way to loosen those as the tide changes. But keep in mind with these barges, yeah, and I'm familiar with the Long Island ones system that you're talking about. I've been anywhere there's a slip, I try to go if I can. But um, the one of the big differences is that the tides in on the East Coast are usually, most places are only a couple feet, 2 to 3 feet. You've got tides, and even the lowest ones along in this market are the ones in Seattle, which are about 10 feet. And so your maximum tides are that. And so you have to have, and that the other thing that's different is that almost all the barges in the Northwest, have to be repositioned, except the ones like the CP operation, which is very similar to what they do in Long Island. But all the other barges almost always have to be repositioned, because I haven't seen a barge other than the CP ones up there that had less than 4 tracks on it. And so one way or another, you're going to have to reposition it when most of your slips are 3-track.